The letter was not long. That was the first thing Cecily noticed, turning it in her hands in the dim passage behind the back stairs. A single folded sheet, cream paper gone soft at the crease, the seal already broken by the time old Tobias had pressed it into her hands. The writing inside was spare and deliberate, the hand of a man who chose each word as he chose a weapon. Quiet, considered, certain of its damage. She had read it twice. She was reading it a third time when she heard the Duke's voice carry through the stone wall from somewhere deep in the house, low and unhurried, addressing some morning question she could not make out. She stood very still. The candle in the passage sconce had guttered to its last inch. Through the small leaded window above the stair, the Derbyshire hills showed gray and close under a November sky, the parkland stripped of leaves, the great oaks standing in the posture of things that have endured and expect to endure further. Ashmore Park, at this hour, had a particular quality of silence, the house not yet fully awake, the servants moving below with the careful tread of people who had learned not to make themselves known. Cecily knew that tread well. She had been walking it for 3 months. She read the letter a 4th time, though she did not need to. The words had settled in her the way cold settles, not at the surface but underneath it. The letter was addressed to a man named Crow, who had been engaged, some weeks past, as temporary ostler for the Ashmore stables during the house party's duration. It was from a man Cecily knew. She had hoped, until this morning, that she would never be forced to think of him at Ashmore. The letter instructed Mr. Crow in language that managed to be both oblique and unmistakable. There was a ride planned for the following Thursday morning. The Duke's gray Agamemnon was the horse he preferred for that terrain. A weakened girth, the letter suggested, became undetectable after the fact if the work was done with patience. The sum named was £40. £40 to arrange an accident on a Derbyshire hillside. Tobias had found it tucked behind the pommel plate of the saddle in question, after Crow had quit his position without notice 2 nights ago. A man who bolted in the night had reason to bolt. The letter remained, as incriminating documents often do, overlooked in the haste of departure. "I did not know who to bring it to," Tobias had said in the stable yard, his breath white in the cold. He was 63 years old and had served the Grail family since the old Duke's time. He held his hat with both hands the way he always did when something pressed on him. "I did not think I ought to carry it to the house, Miss Vane. Not when it names who it names." Cecily had read the signature at the bottom of the letter and said nothing for a long moment. "You were right to come to me," she said at last. "Thank you, Tobias." She had not told him what she intended to do with it. She had not, in truth, decided. Now she stood in the back passage with the letter in her hands and the Duke's voice somewhere beyond the stone wall, and she turned the problem over, the way she turned everything difficult, carefully, and without flinching at what she found. The man who had written this letter was Mr. Reginald Voss. He was the Duke's second cousin, and if the Duke died without issue, Reginald Voss would inherit the Duchy of Ashmore. He was also, as Cecily had cause to know personally, a man who arranged the ruin of others at a distance and called it business. 3 years ago, he had been a silent partner in the trading house where her father had worked. The fraud that had destroyed her father's reputation and ended his life had originated, she believed, with Voss. She had no proof of that. She had only her father's last letter, written in a shaking hand, naming Voss as the source of the accusation. And she had no standing to make accusations, being a disgraced debtor's daughter and a companion, which was to say a servant with a better accent. The letter in her hands was proof of something else entirely. She folded it carefully along its original creases and tucked it into the inside pocket of her pelisse, against her ribs, where she could feel the faint crinkle of it with each breath. Then she went to find Lady Dorothea's morning tray, because it was 7:30, and Lady Dorothea did not forgive tardiness. Whatever else she forgave. It was worth pausing here, before the house awoke fully, to say something about Cecily Vane as she moved through Ashmore's service corridors. She was 24 years old, slight and upright, with a quality of attention in her face that some people found disconcerting and most people overlooked. She had brown hair that she wore in a plain knot, brown eyes that did not flicker, and the kind of still hands that came from growing up in a household where the money had always been uncertain. She had been educated above her current station, which was the particular cruelty of her situation. She had read Locke and could play 2 instruments, and she spent her days fetching shawls and reading aloud and sitting quietly in corners so that Lady Dorothea could feel attended without feeling observed. She had been a companion and nothing more, as Lady Dorothea had said to Miss Phoebe Crane in the morning room 6 days ago, when Miss Crane had asked who the young woman was who sat so still by the window. Cecily had been 2 rooms away. She had heard every word. She had set down the embroidery she had been unpicking and picked it up again. The Duke had entered Ashmore's sphere of her awareness on the 2nd morning of her employment, when she had been crossing the gallery with a stack of her late predecessor's books and had found him in the corridor, having arrived a day early from London. He had not expected to see anyone. She had not expected to see him. He had looked at her with the particular attention of a man accustomed to assessing things quickly. And he had said, "I beg your pardon?" though it was not clear which of them was most in the other's way. And Cecily had said, "Not at all, Your Grace," and stepped aside, and he had passed. And that had been that. Except that he had paused at the end of the corridor and turned back. "Those are Hollingsworth's natural histories," he said. "You have them in the wrong order." "I know," she said. "I am sorting them." He had looked at her again, something fractionally altered in his face, and then he had gone. She had thought about that look for longer than was sensible. Edmund Grail was 34 years old, dark-haired, and built on the lines of a man who had spent years in the army and had not subsequently grown soft. He had a face that gave very little away, not from coldness but from discipline, the face of someone who had learned that what he showed publicly would be held against him or used to harm those near him. He was not unkind. He was not easy. He was the sort of man who noticed things he had no practical reason to notice, and Cecily, who made her living by noticing things others missed, found this quality in him both illuminating and dangerous. The house party had been Lady Dorothea's arrangement. 14 guests, a fortnight in November, a program of shooting and riding and evening entertainments organized with the transparent aim of placing Miss Phoebe Crane in close proximity to the Duke, for long enough that a proposal became the natural conclusion. Miss Crane was 21, blonde, polished, and possessed of $12,000 a year, and a mother who had been Lady Dorothea's particular friend since girlhood. She was also, Cecily had assessed within 2 days, genuinely pleasant, which made everything worse. The Duke bore it all with the expression of a man completing a task he had set himself. Cecily had been managing his aunt's correspondence the morning she looked up from a letter and found him in the doorway of the morning room, standing at the edge of the space with his hands behind his back, watching her. "Lady Dorothea is in the orangery," she said, because it was the most useful thing she could offer. "I know," he said. He did not move for a moment. Then he said, "The Hollingsworth collection has been properly ordered. I noticed. That was your work." "Yes, Your Grace." "The index was missing 3 volumes. I found them in the attic room." "I sent the footman for those yesterday morning," she said. They have not yet been catalogued. He had looked at her then with the same quality of attention as in the corridor, held one beat longer, and then he had gone. And Cecily had set down the letter she was holding and sat for a moment with her hands very still in her lap, conscious of something shifting in her own interior that she had not given permission to shift. She was a companion. She sat in corners. She existed to be useful and otherwise invisible. She had accepted this. She had not liked it, but she had accepted it. She did not permit herself to name what she had felt in the moment he looked at her. If you have stayed long enough to wonder what a woman in Cecily's position might do with a letter like that, you will understand something about the kind of courage that does not announce itself. Stay with her a while longer. If you have ever waited in a house for something dreadful to arrive while pretending to your daily duties that it has not yet begun its approach, you will understand the particular quality of those next days. Cecily carried the letter against her ribs. She sorted letters and fetched shawls and read aloud and sat in corners. She watched Voss, who arrived on a Tuesday with 2 changes of horse and the confident air of a man who expected the door to open before he reached it. He was 3 inches shorter than the Duke, broader through the shoulder, with a pleasant face that had learned very young to arrange itself into an expression of easy amiability. He pressed the Duke's hand warmly. He complimented Lady Dorothea's arrangements. He drank the Duke's wine and sat at the Duke's table and smiled at the Duke's guests. He did not look at Cecily when he entered the room. She noticed. Men like Voss did not look at companions. The Tuesday evening dinner was 14 at table, candlelight, the silver out. Cecily sat at the lower end, near the widow of a Lincolnshire baronet, who talked pleasantly about her grandchildren and required little management. She watched Reginald at the upper end of the table, watched him lean toward the Duke and say something that made the Duke's jaw tighten very briefly before he answered, and she pressed one hand against her ribs under the table and felt the faint crinkle of the folded letter. "Your dress is quite plain," said a voice beside her, carrying just far enough. It was Voss, during the post-dinner movement between rooms, when the company was milling in the hall. He was not looking at her. He was addressing the air somewhere between himself and the wall. Lady Dorothea's little companion. I had wondered how she filled the position. A pause, calibrated. A companion, and nothing more, I suppose. One must have someone to carry the reticule. 3 men within earshot did not react. 2 of them glanced at Cecily, and away. Cecily did not change her expression. She said, "Good evening, Mr. Voss," and crossed to Lady Dorothea's side and did not look back. She had not flushed. She had not looked down. She had said good evening to the man who had destroyed her father's name with the same measured courtesy she brought to every difficult thing. And that steadiness had cost her something she would not have named in this company. The room had watched, she knew. The room had rendered its verdict, as rooms always did in this season, in a dozen small adjustments of posture and attention. Fans raised and conversations resumed, the machinery of dismissal operating with its usual smooth efficiency. She was a companion. She had been reminded of it. At the door of the drawing room, she felt the air shift near her shoulder and turned to find the Duke standing a pace behind her, holding a glass he had not drunk from. He was looking toward the hall, toward the place where Reginald had been, and his face was doing that still, settled thing it did when he was assessing. Then he looked at her. "Miss Vane," he said, which was already a greater attention than most of the room gave her. "Your Grace," she said. "You are well?" The question was quiet, direct, without social decoration. "Perfectly well," she said. "Thank you." He held her gaze one moment past comfort, and then let it go, stepping into the drawing room. And Cecily stood in the doorway for a count of 3, aware of where he was in the room without looking for him. aware of the precise angle of her own shoulder, and the fact that her heart was beating at a rate she could not attribute purely to Reginald's remark. She had never told herself she felt nothing. She had only told herself it was not relevant. The portrait gallery ran the length of the east wing on the second floor, 12 feet of turkey carpet and painted eyes going back 200 years. Cecily passed through it on the Wednesday evening carrying a lamp, having been sent by Lady Dorothea to retrieve a particular embroidery pattern from the library at the far end. The house was quiet. The house party had settled into the drawing room below. She could hear the piano distantly and the murmur of conversation. She was halfway along the gallery when she saw him. He stood before the second-to-last portrait in the row, a large canvas in a gilded frame that showed a man some years younger than himself, dark-haired, with a broader face and an easier expression. He stood with his hands at his sides and his head slightly bowed, and he did not hear her until she was nearly past him. Then he turned, and she stopped. And for a moment neither of them said anything. "I am sorry to disturb you, Your Grace," she said at last. "You have not," he said. He looked back at the portrait. "My brother Charles." Cecily did not speak. There are moments in which silence is the only form of respect. "He died 2 years ago," the Duke said. "Fever. He was 31 years old, and he died in 3 days, and I was at a regimental dinner in Brussels." A pause. "There was no warning. There was a letter that reached me the morning after he was buried." The lamp threw warm light up the wall, softening the painted faces. Cecily stood very still, holding the light, and watched the side of his face, and saw him see his brother, and did not look away. "By the time you could have reached him," she said carefully, "he was already gone." "Yes? You know that?" "Yes." He turned to look at her then. "Knowing and believing are not the same thing, Miss Vane." She felt that sentence land in her chest in a place she had not expected. "No," she said quietly. "They are not." He looked at her, and it was not the assessing glance from the corridor or the doorway. It was something else. Something that belonged to this particular hour and this particular candlelight, and the fact that they were the only 2 people in this gallery. And both of them knew it. She felt it in her throat, in her wrists, in the slight involuntary forward press of her weight before she caught herself and stayed where she was. He did not move either. The candle flame between them was very still. There was no draught in the gallery at this hour, and the stillness of the air gave the light a particular quality, warm and unmoving, the kind of light that slows everything it touches. Cecily was aware of his hands at his sides, of the line of his jaw, of the fact that neither of them had shifted in the last half-minute. Her breath was quieter than it had been. She noticed that. She was not accustomed to noticing her own breath. She had been invisible in this house for 3 months. She had grown accustomed to the particular discipline of existing inside a room without registering in it. This man had never once treated her as invisible, and she did not know what to do with that. Standing in the lamplight with his brother's portrait at his back and the November dark at the windows. "I should not keep you from the library," he said at last, his voice low. "No," she agreed, and made herself move. She collected the embroidery pattern. She returned to Lady Dorothea. She sat for the remainder of the evening in her corner, and attended to her duties, and did not once look toward him, which was the most precise and effortful thing she had done in 3 months. The Thursday morning dawned clear and cold, the kind of November morning that makes the Derbyshire hills look freshly cut. Cecily woke early, as she always did, and dressed and went down before the house was fully stirring. She went to the stable yard. because she had a letter of her own to post, and the yard groom could take it to the village with the morning's dispatches. She found Tobias at the far end of the yard, turning out the stalls. He looked up when she came through the gate and touched his hat. She gave him the letter, and was turning to go when she saw the Duke. He had come out through the side door and was crossing the yard toward the stables, greatcoat on, boots already muddy at the heel, moving with the purposeful unhurriedness of a man who had been awake for some time. He saw her, and he paused, and she saw him notice the letter in Tobias's hand. And then he looked at Tobias. "What have you there?" Tobias held up the letter. "Miss Vane's, Your Grace. To Mr. Hartwell, the solicitor." The Duke looked at Cecily. He did not ask the obvious question. She could see it regardless. "Tobias's granddaughter requires a particular treatment," she said. "Mr. Hartwell holds my quarterly wage in trust. I have asked him to release a portion of it to the surgeon." She said it plainly, because it was plain. "It is not a significant sum," Tobias said quickly. "She would not let me refuse, Your Grace. I tried." Cecily said nothing. She was watching the Duke's face. He stood in the cold morning with his hands in the pockets of his greatcoat and looked at her for a long moment, and something in his expression went through several changes she could not have named. She was aware of the cold, of the smell of hay and horse, of the cloud of her own breath in the air between them. He stepped forward, and she thought he was going to say something. And instead, he reached out and opened the gate she was standing at, because she was still holding it half open, and his gloved hand closed briefly over hers on the latch. The touch lasted no more than 2 seconds. It was a gloved hand on a gloved hand. She felt it in her collarbone. "Thank you," he said, and it was not entirely clear what he was thanking her for. He passed through the gate and on toward the stables, and Cecily stood in the cold with her hand on the latch and the impression of his fingers still registering in her palm, and made herself breathe normally. The threat came on Friday morning, in the passage outside the library. She had been returning a book and had turned from the shelf to find Voss blocking the doorway. He pulled the door almost closed behind him. The passage was empty. The fire in the grate had burned low, and the room was cool, and she was aware immediately of the fact that no one was within calling distance. He was pleasant about it. That was the particular quality of Voss. He was always pleasant. He had the specific pleasantness of a man who has discovered that a smooth surface is more unnerving than an aggressive one, that people become uncertain in the face of warmth they cannot reconcile with the threat beneath it. He smiled, and he told her that he knew about the letter. He told her that his man Crow had informed him of its disappearance. He told her that he had made inquiries, and had determined, from the pattern of those inquiries, that the letter had almost certainly come to her. He spoke in the measured tone of a man conducting a business negotiation. "You are in a precarious position, Miss Vane," he said. "Your father's fraud is not widely known in this house. It could become so." She said nothing. "Return the letter to me this evening," he said, "and the matter ends here. You have no standing. You are a companion and nothing more. No magistrate in England will credit the word of Edward Vane's disgraced daughter over mine." She thought about her father. She thought about the letter she had kept tucked against her ribs for a week. The document in his shaking hand that named Voss as the source of the fabricated accusation that had destroyed him. She thought about the way the Duke had stood before his brother's portrait. "I will return it to you this evening," she said, and her voice was steady. She went to her room. She copied the letter in her own handwriting, word for word, on a sheet of her own paper. She took her time with it, matching the letter forms as closely as she could, the slope of the capitals, the particular way the T's were crossed with a slight upward press. Then she burned the copy and folded the original and locked it in the small tin box beneath her floorboard, where she kept the few things that mattered. Her father's last letter. Her mother's ring. 3 months of carefully saved wages. In its place, she assembled what she would surrender, aged it very slightly by holding it near the washstand steam, and allowed it to cool. Then she waited until the evening assembly had drawn everyone into the drawing room, went to the back passage, and left the false original in the agreed location. A folded sheet of cream paper. She had matched the hand closely enough. Voss collected it. He examined it. He was satisfied. Cecily went to her room and sat on the edge of the bed and waited. The letter was still under the floorboard. She had done what she could. Whether it would be enough was not entirely within her determination. The problem was the one Reginald had named. She had no standing. She was a companion. She was the daughter of a man the world had convicted of fraud in absentia. She could walk to the Duke's study and knock on the door and lay the letter on his desk, and the question of whether he would credit it, whether he would credit her, sat in her chest like a stone. She had not let herself think about the portrait gallery, or the stable-yard gate, or the quality of his voice when he said her name in the corridor. She had not let herself think about what it meant that she could not bring herself to leave him to Reginald's design and simply walk away. On Saturday morning, she began packing her trunk. Lady Dorothea would have to be told she was leaving, and some reason given, and Cecily turned over possible reasons while she folded her gowns. She had 2 good gowns and 4 serviceable ones, and a pelisse that had been her mother's, taken in twice. She had her father's letter in the tin box, and the original from Reginald's saddle, and 5.5 months' wages saved. She had, she supposed, a destination, though she had not yet chosen it. She was taking down the books she had brought when she heard the knock. It was not a guest's knock. It was Tobias's knock, the particular flat 2-rap he used at her door when something was wrong. She opened it, and his face confirmed it before he spoke. "He came to me, Miss Vane," Tobias said. He was holding his hat again, both hands, the way he did when something pressed. "The Duke? He found me in the yard this morning, and he asked me directly about the letter I found. He said he had reason to believe there was a document missing from the saddlery." A pause. "I told him what I knew. I told him I had brought it to you," he said, and stopped himself. "He asked me to ask you to come to his study, Miss Vane. He asked it as a kindness." She stood in the doorway of her half-packed room and thought about the stone in her chest. "I will come," she said. He was standing when she entered. Not behind the desk, but in front of it, as if he had been pacing and had stopped when he heard her knock. The study was a quiet, dark-walled room with a fire burning and 2 windows looking onto the gray November park. He had the quality, standing in it, of a man who was managing something carefully. "Miss Vane," he said. "Thank you for coming." She crossed the room and took the letter from her pocket, still in its original folds, still bearing the careful, deliberate hand she had memorized, and placed it on the desk between them. He read it. He read it twice. His face did not change during the reading, but she watched his jaw, and she could see the thing that moved there, beneath the discipline. When he finished, he set the letter down and looked at her. "When did you receive this?" he said. "A week ago," she said. "Tobias found it the morning after Mr. Crow left." "And Voss?" "He approached me on Friday. He believed I had returned the original to him." She paused. "I copied it first." He held her gaze for a long time. "You have been carrying this," he said quietly, "for a week." I was not certain you would credit it, she said. I am not a reliable witness. I am a disgraced debtor's daughter. Voss took care to say so. He said, He knew your father? He was the source of the accusation against him. She said it evenly. I have my father's letter naming him, though it would likely be dismissed as a grieving man's attempt to distribute his blame. He crossed the room in 3 strides and stood before her, not close enough to be improper, close enough that she was acutely aware of his height and the set of his shoulders, and the fact that he was looking at her with an expression that was not the careful discipline of the corridor, but something below it, something she had not seen him allow before. I credit it, he said. His voice was even. I credit every word of it. I credit you, Miss Vane. She felt her breath catch. Voss will deny it, she said. He will, Edmund said. He will not do so convincingly. He has been pressing me for a private audience since Tuesday, and I have declined it, and I have noticed the way he looks at Agamemnon, and then at me. I had not put it together until this morning. A pause. Waited. I had not thought it possible that a man could act with this degree of calculation against his own kin. He thought of you as an obstacle, Cecily said. Men like Voss are very good at thinking of people as obstacles. He looked at her with the intensity that had been building for 3 weeks, the quality of attention she had been refusing to name. I do not want you to leave, he said. It came out with the precision of a man who had chosen to say a thing plainly rather than circuitously. I know you have been packing. Tobias told me. She said, I am a companion, Your Grace. No, he said, and something in his voice shifted, became softer, and at the same time more certain. You are not. That is not what you are to this house. That is not what you are to me. He did not look away. I am not saying this because you have saved my life, though you have. I am saying it because I have been watching you for 3 weeks, and I know what I have seen, and I know what it means. Cecily stood very still. The fire crackled. The November park sat gray and patient outside the window. She was aware of every inch of the distance between them, aware of the pull of it, aware of everything she had been refusing to permit herself for 3 weeks. She said, The house party. The house party is leaving in 4 days, he said. Miss Crane is a pleasant woman who does not want me and is too well-mannered to say so. Lady Dorothea will be disappointed. A pause. I will survive her disappointment. Cecily looked at him. He held her gaze, steady and open, and she felt the full weight of it, all of it. The study and the fire and the gray park and this man who had stood before his brother's portrait and told her that knowing and believing were not the same thing. She did not say yes yet. She was not the sort of woman who said yes before she understood what she was saying it to. He did not press her. She noticed this. He stood and waited, his face patient, and she understood that he was a man who had learned the difference between asking and demanding, and that he had chosen, in this moment, to ask. She looked at him in the firelight of his own study and thought about the portrait gallery and the stable-yard gate and the quality of his voice when he spoke his brother's name. She thought about what it was to be seen by someone who had no practical reason to see you, who had derived no social advantage from it, who had done it simply because accurate perception was the reflex closest to his nature. I am not afraid of your aunt, she said at last. It was not quite the thing she had meant to say. It was true, though. Something shifted in his expression, something warm beneath the discipline, and she thought for a moment that he might reach for her hand again, the way he had at the gate. He did not. He waited. Let us deal with Reginald first, she said. Something moved briefly across his face that was almost like relief. "Yes," he said. "Let us." The drawing room that evening held 12 people, arranged in the comfortable disorder of a house party 4 days from its conclusion. Fires had been lit at both ends of the room. The piano stood open. Miss Crane sat near the window in a pale green gown, speaking quietly with a friend, and glanced up when the door opened, expecting, perhaps, the Duke. She did not quite manage to conceal the calculation in her look. Lady Dorothea sat near the center of the room like a general holding territory, her fan precisely placed, her diamonds catching the firelight. Voss stood near the drinks table with a glass of brandy and the air of a man who expects to make an announcement. Cecily sat in her usual corner. She did not look at the door. The Duke entered at 8:30. He entered as he always entered, without ceremony, crossing directly to the center of the room, and Lady Dorothea turned toward him with the smoothed expectation of a woman about to see her arrangements completed. Reginald set down his glass and moved forward. He said, "Edmund, I hoped we might have a word before the evening advances. There is a matter of some significance I wish to raise with the company." The room settled into the kind of quiet that gathers before something. "I imagine there is," said Edmund Grayle in a tone that carried clearly to every corner. He did not look at Reginald yet. He looked at Cecily. He crossed the room. It was not a dramatic crossing. He walked with the same quiet purposefulness he brought to everything. And the room turned to watch him, one face at a time, because it was a small room, and he was walking to a corner where Lady Dorothea's companion sat, which was not something that happened. Lady Dorothea's fan stilled. Miss Crane looked up from the window. Reginald went very quiet. The Duke stopped before Cecily and offered her his hand, his expression open and particular, for her and the room simultaneously. "Miss Vane," he said, clearly enough to be heard at every point of the room's compass. She took his hand. She stood. She met his eyes and found in them what she had found in the study, the thing below the discipline, warm and steady, and entirely certain. "Miss Vane is not a companion," he said, into the settled quiet of the room. "She is my intended." The room was very still for a beat, the kind of stillness that descends when something happens that was not in the evening's program and everyone present knows it. Lady Dorothea made a sound that was not quite words. Miss Crane looked at her hands, and a small smile crossed her face that might, in another context, have been called relieved. Voss stood near the drinks table with the expression of a man watching the ground shift beneath his feet and finding it has further to shift yet. He understood. Cecily could see it. That the Duke, who was looking at him now, was not the same man who had declined his private audiences. He understood that something had been discovered. He had not yet calculated how much, or by whom. He was still holding her hand. He turned from the room to her, and she saw him see her, the way she had been waiting without knowing she was waiting to be seen, and she thought of her father's letter in the tin box, and the cream paper with Reginald's careful, deliberate hand, and 3 months of plain gowns in glittering rooms, and the feel of his gloved hand on hers at the stable yard gate. She pressed his hand in return, once, quietly. Mr. Hartwell, the solicitor, was summoned the following morning. Voss was confronted privately by the Duke and the solicitor with the letter as evidence, and presented with the choice between a quiet withdrawal from Ashmore and all associated claims and a magistrate's inquiry that would likely conclude in transportation. He chose the former. He left before dinner. He did not say goodbye to anyone, and no one asked him to. Lady Dorothea required 2 days and several conversations before she arrived at acceptance, which she did, characteristically, by reframing the situation as her own idea, She told Miss Crane's mother, when they departed, that she had always thought Cecily a girl of particular quality, and that she was glad Edmund had the sense to see it. Cecily heard this report from Tobias, who had it from the housekeeper, who had it from Lady Dorothea's own lady's maid. She did not tell Edmund. She thought perhaps she would, some day, when it would make him smile. The library at Ashmore was warm in December, 2 fires going, the long windows frosted at their edges. Cecily sat in the chair nearest the larger fire, a lamp on the table beside her, and in her hands she held the letter. She had kept it, even after the solicitor had taken his copy and Reginald had gone. It was the original, cream paper soft at the crease, the seal broken, the handwriting spare and deliberate. She was not sure why she had kept it. She thought perhaps it was because things that had mattered to her were scarce enough that she was in the habit of keeping them. She heard Edmund come in and did not look up. He crossed the room and settled into the chair beside hers, close enough that she could feel the warmth of him at her side, and they sat together in the manner of 2 people who have not yet arrived at the question, but are no longer afraid of it. After a moment he said, "What are you thinking?" "I am thinking," she said, "about how long a person can be in a room before someone looks at them." He was quiet. Then he said, "I looked at you the first day." "I know," she said. "I noticed. You gave no sign of it," he said. And there was something very close to amusement in his voice, something she had not heard there before. She found she liked the sound of it. "Neither did you," she said. He took the letter gently from her hands and set it on the table, and he kept her hand in both of his. And outside the library windows, the Derbyshire hills showed pale under the first snow of winter, and the fire beside them crackled once and settled. And the room was warm, and she was in it, and she had been seen. If Cecily's story moved you, leave a note in the comments about the moment that stayed with you longest. And thank you for staying until the end.